Today's podcast is a joint episode of TASH Amplified and Yes to Employment. It is part of a series of podcasts, blog posts, and social media the TASH and the Yes Center are producing in recognition of National Disability Employment Awareness Month, or NDEAM. To see what else we are doing, search for the NDEAM or NDEAM75 hashtags on social media. Today, TASH's Interim Executive Director, Serena Lowe, talks with Alison Barkoff, who is, among many other things, the Director of Advocacy at the Center for Public Representation. They have a wide-ranging discussion of employment policy and programs for people with disabilities, but Alison remains rooted throughout in her experience as a sibling to her brother with disabilities, Evan.
It's my enormous pleasure to have a great friend of mine, Alison Barkoff, on today's podcast in honor of the National Disability Employment Awareness Month, sponsored by U.S. Department of Labor. We're just so excited to have Alison. For those that don't know Alison, she's currently the Director of Advocacy at the Center for Public Representation here in Washington, D.C., and works on a myriad of policy and litigation issues related to community integration and inclusion, including Olmstead, Medicaid issues, employment, housing, and education. But she has a vast and very long record of being a tremendous advocate of individuals with differing abilities here in Washington and throughout the country. Just a couple of other things about Alison. She was appointed to serve on the Federal Advisory Committee for Competitive Integrated Employment of People with Disabilities, and also is a co-chair currently of the Long-Term Services and Supports Task Force of the Consortium of Citizens with Disabilities. She has testified before Congress and the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights regarding individuals with disabilities in employment. And from 2010 to 2014, served as Special Counsel for Olmstead Enforcement in the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice, where she led a number of efforts to enforce the right of individuals with disabilities to live, work, and receive services in the community. I've known Alison for a number of years, have had the great pleasure of basically walking in her shadow and really trying to hold on to her coattails as she has really, I think, elevated the national conversation here in Washington about federal civil rights and policies that are really intended to create a pathway for individuals with significant disabilities to be a part of the generic workforce and economic mainstream. We've had an opportunity to work in the federal government together. Alison worked both beyond just the Department of Justice, has also spent some time at the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services and also with the Department of Labor. So I just want to thank Alison for coming on the podcast today with me and say welcome.
Thanks so much, Serena, for having me. I'm excited to have a conversation with you today.
Likewise. Well, I saved a little bit of your bio for you to tell us a little bit about your background in terms of how you got into this work and into the field of disabilities, civil rights, and your personal perspective and connection.
Sure. Well, I've had the fortune of calling myself a member of the disability community for almost 40 years. And 40 years ago, when my brother was born, the world was a completely different place. People with intellectual and developmental disabilities like Evan were told, there's no place for you in society. Everyone like Evan, for the most part, was put in institutions, and families were told the best thing for them and for their typical children would be to put their child with a disability away. I was really lucky that my parents said no, and they really wanted the same thing for Evan as they wanted for us. And they were really on the forefront of, having a vision that did not exist at the time. thinking about what inclusion looks like in every aspect of life. Evan was the first generation of kids who had a civil right to attend school. It's kind of hard for me to imagine, thinking back in someone's life who isn't really that old, that kids with disabilities were not even allowed into schools a generation ago. And there was no such thing as community-based services. There was no such thing as employment for people with disabilities. And my parents really, every single thing and every expectation and aspiration they had for me and my sisters, they had for Evan. And I think most importantly, the thing that I've learned from my family, and most importantly from Evan, is how important self-determination is, how important self-advocacy is. And I've had the pleasure of being part of policy change over the last 40 years with a guiding light of people with disabilities want lives that look like people without disabilities. They want a job, they want friends, they want to be a valued member of their community, they want to make choices for themselves, they want to try things and have a right to fail. And so that's really been my approach to disability advocacy.
Wow, what a great story about Evan and his journey, and the power of family and personal supports that we all need, right, along our path and our journey in life. That's great. I'm going to switch it up here a little bit based on kind of that background, because I know in your work you've had an opportunity to collaborate at a state level with a lot of local communities, with many state protection and advocacy entities, with councils of individuals with developmental disabilities. And you've worked with these groups to really help state governments think about how they're investing in individuals and in services, and making sure that they are strategically focusing resources toward creating competitive integrated employment options for individuals with significant disabilities. In your mind, and based on the experiences you have, what do you think are the top 2 or 3 barriers that continue to stifle or impede individuals with significant disabilities from seeking and obtaining employment in their communities?
So I think there are a couple barriers that remain. I think one important thing, and so much of my work is not only to kind of do the inside DC policy work, working with Congress and working with federal agencies, but where the rubber really hits the road is at disability service systems. So I think one big barrier that I see is, we have this kind of this general agreement and federal laws that really are about prioritizing competitive integrated employment. And we have at a state level a lot of, philosophy around employment first. But we haven't yet seen systems and the supports that help people get jobs change along those same lines. Most states, despite having these employment first policies, when you look at what is their actual capacity for supports, most money and most providers are in congregate day services, things like sheltered workshops or day habilitation. And such a small piece of the service system is really about helping people get real jobs at real pay out in the community. So this lack of access is really a big issue that we need to keep working on. The second thing is, I think we haven't quite changed expectations. So I work with so many families, and an important part of my work is with families and young families and with self-advocates. And so many people understand the importance of inclusion in schools. We have, in almost every school district I've worked with, inclusion task forces, those mama tigers who are fighting to have their kid in a regular classroom, yet they're so focused on school, they don't think about the adult system. And there's literally a cliff that people fall off from the special education and employment system into the adult system. And people get there and they don't know that this kind of fight for inclusion has got to continue. They're kind of told, well, we have a program for your son or daughter. And they don't know that they should be saying the same way they did for their kid's entire career. Nope, you know what? My expectation for my other kids is they go to college or they get a job and they support themselves. And so they don't know to push for inclusion and for real employment. So that's a big barrier we're still working on. I literally talk to kindergarten parents and say, start planning now for adult life. Start thinking about employment. Start thinking about independent living. And then I'd say kind of the third piece that is a big barrier is we have a system that is set up so against employment in many ways. The only way people with significant disabilities can get supports and supports that they would need for employment is typically through the Medicaid system. And Medicaid is a program that is about giving healthcare to people in poverty. Poverty is a requirement for it. So, people fight so hard to get these home and community-based services, and they spend decades waiting on wait lists. And then they get there, they get the supports, and then they realize, oh my God, it's so hard to figure out. If I work, what does that mean? Am I going to lose access to all of these critical community services? How do I navigate these asset limits and these other barriers? And there are ways. There are special Medicaid buy-in programs. We really need to be thinking about financial planning. And frankly, we really need to rethink our entire healthcare system, because home and community-based services should not be tied to having to live a life of poverty. But it's really complicated. And sometimes families and self-advocates themselves get really confused and they think it's just too complicated. I mean, to make it real, my brother had a long-time job. It was a great fit for him. He was engaged in competitive integrated employment. And because of COVID-19, he and many, many of his peers were furloughed. He was really able to pivot. And because he has this long history of work and he has great supports and he self-directs his employment supports, he actually was able to find another job. And we had to spend so much time before he took this job negotiating down his salary. We literally had to do the math to figure out, okay, how many hours a week does he need to work to be able to get employment benefits? But how much could he be paid and not lose his home and community-based services waiver, the supports that help him live independently and give him transportation and give him medical supports that he needs? And it just hit home. We are in 2020. This is a family that is a family of disability advocates. We are all about competitive integrated employment and inclusion and community living. And we had to go in and negotiate down his salary. And I think that just spoke to me about, we have big systemic changes that we need to make if we want people with disabilities to have careers just like everyone else.
And just for those that are listening and following along, but may never have had to go, bat to bat with one of the systems, when you say you had to help negotiate Evan's pay down so that he wouldn't lose critical home and community-based services, that's because he wasn't going to make enough money to actually pay for those services on his own, right? Like there's a huge discrepancy there, right? And so can you speak a little bit more to kind of what the asset limit issue is and what that kind of means, both in Evan's case, but in many other families throughout the country?
Sure. I mean, one problem is that these critical home and community-based services that Evan gets, and so many people to live independently. So, a direct support professional who helps Evan with independent living skills and budgeting and transportation, those are not things actually most people can private pay for. Private insurance doesn't cover those kinds of things, which is why people have to rely on Medicaid. So, even people who are, lawyers or, professionals making a lot of money, many times they have to either decrease their assets and their income to meet Medicaid or move to a state where there's a generous Medicaid buy-in program. For Evan, we had to negotiate with his employer. So the amount of money that he would get in a paycheck wouldn't put him above these limits to be eligible for Medicaid and for Social Security. Because if he lost those, then it's not just that he would lose employment supports, it's that he would lose the entire package of services. So that's why so many people in the disability community kind of have to become policy experts on Medicaid. That's why when we talk about healthcare and, there's been so much in Congress this year about Medicaid, for the disability community, this isn't just about like going to the doctor. I mean, this is literally the difference between being segregated and locked away in an institution or being able to participate in the community. So, for those of us who are focused on community integration and inclusion, we kind of have no choice but to become Medicaid policy wonky people.
Right, absolutely. Thank you for kind of distilling that, because I do think that there is still just a lack of knowledge or true understanding by so many policymakers and taxpayers out there about how these programs work, and that our policies are still so archaic in how they look and perceive the abilities of individuals to work and participate, even if they need these supports, and how the money works, and that there are great incentives out there that are really discouraging individuals with significant disabilities from pursuing employment, even though many of them want to and want to be a part of our communities and work and live and thrive like everyone else. So I think you gave us a really real world example. And I know your family is one of millions, right? That's kind of going through this dilemma. You've done a lot is even, I would just say a word I never get to use, a humongous amount of policy advocacy work here in Washington, focused on fostering systems change at the state and federal level that would lead to greater opportunities for individuals with different abilities to work, to live, and thrive in our communities. Can you briefly describe for folks who may not be as familiar with inside Washington politics, what some of these federal advocacy efforts are and some of the coalition efforts that you're currently leading to help foster more inclusive, equitable communities?
Sure. So, inside DC, people always think about Congress, and certainly so much of our advocacy has been with Congress, and I'll touch on those in a minute. But I think equally as important is the work that we do with federal agencies that are charged with implementing federal statutes and federal regulations. I've had the chance to do a lot of incredible work with Congress. Some of it has been moving the ball forward, and unfortunately, a lot of it over the last several years has been really educating members of Congress about why some of the positions that they're taking are so harmful to people with disabilities. Healthcare, and I talk about healthcare kind of in a really broad way, and employment is part of it because we talked about the fact that employment supports are primarily provided through Medicaid. And so much of the last 3.5 years in Washington, D.C. has been about making sure and fighting to protect programs like Medicaid from huge cuts or huge restructuring. and making sure that people with disabilities are not discriminated against in accessing healthcare, which was a really important piece of the Affordable Care Act. When you hear the word pre-existing condition, just think equal sign disability. Every single person with a disability is someone who has a pre-existing condition. And I think back to our healthcare situation growing up as a family, and my family not being able to get health insurance because Evan had Down syndrome, or being told like we have to pay more, or saying we have certain limits. So a lot of our policy advocacy with Congress has had to focus on that. On the other hand, we have had some really important opportunities to move things forward. And employment is one place where I think in this Congress, we've had some really important bills. People may not know that people with disabilities, it is currently legal under federal wage laws to pay people with disabilities less than you pay anyone else. We call it subminimum wages. And that means people like Evan can be working in this work site that are called sheltered workshops. There are these segregated settings that are all people with disabilities, and they can be paid as little as pennies an hour. It's completely inconsistent with modern federal disability policy and with modern statutes, but we still have a Fair Labor Standards Act that allows that. In this Congress, we have made such great progress in two ways. First is there was a bill that was introduced called the Transformation to Competitive Employment Act. And for the first time, it really brings together that people with disabilities have to have a right to be paid the same as everyone else, but making sure that we are expanding the kinds of supports that people need to be able to work in competitive integrated employment. So it's a combination of a phase out with funding to states to expand supports to people with disabilities. It's bipartisan in the House. It is not yet bipartisan in the Senate, but we had a lot of interest there. And I am hoping it is something that really is going to pick up some momentum in the next Congress. We also, for the first time, made really clear that when we are thinking about raising the wage for all Americans, all means all, and that includes people with disabilities. And a bill that was introduced called Raise the Wage, which is about raising the minimum wage from $7.25 an hour over time up to $15 an hour across the country. Everybody deserves a living wage. It was really important that this bill included eliminating subminimum wages for people with disabilities and including people with disabilities in this bill. And it passed the House, and that was the first time that a bill has passed any chamber of Congress to end subminimum wages. So those are some things with Congress that we've been working on. With the federal agencies, there's really important work going on. In the Obama administration, there was a federal regulation that was passed, and I was really privileged actually to work with Serena on this in my time inside the government. And it's called the Home and Community-Based Services Settings Rule, the HCBS Settings Rule. And what that rule says is that anyone who receives home and community-based services has a right to have all of the benefits of community living. So being able to be part of the community, being able to make choices in your daily life, being able to access the broader community, and related to employment, that people with disabilities must have opportunities for competitive integrated employment. We've been working really hard with the federal agency that oversees that rule, called the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. And this is a really important place where, federal policy translates at the state level. As part of a coalition that I help lead called the HCBS Advocacy Coalition, we've been making sure state-based advocates know about this rule and know about the opportunities to impact plans that states have to make the rule real in their states. We worked really hard to make sure there was this opportunity for stakeholder input in the rule. It is required. And so we feel like it's kind of our job to support self-advocates and family members and progressive providers to use this rule to say, what is it that's missing in our system? How are we not getting the services that we need that kind of help us live independent and inclusive lives and have opportunities for competitive integrated employment? So that's a big piece that we're doing through the HCBS Advocacy Coalition. There's important employment policy that's also happening at federal agencies. And most people would be surprised to know this, but a lot of the employment policy happens within the US Department of Education, because we have a vocational rehabilitation services system that's a federally funded system that exists in all states, and it's a part of the Department of Education. We've been working very hard on policies that implement a federal law that was passed in 2014 called the Workforce Innovation and Opportunities Act that prioritizes federal funding for competitive integrated employment and really limits the situations where people with disabilities can be placed in sub-minimum wage and segregated settings. And we've been pushing very hard in this administration for the Department of Education to really strongly implement this rule, be clear that competitive integrated employment is not just about wages, but is also about people with disabilities being able to work alongside coworkers without disabilities and getting the same benefits as people without disabilities in a workplace, and making sure that people who are in segregated sub-minimum wage settings are educated and given information about opportunities for competitive integrated employment and supported to make informed decisions about those choices. So the Collaboration to Promote Self-Determination is another coalition that I'm part of, where we really focus on transition age youth and that transition from school to the adult system, particularly around employment, and have really worked with Congress and with federal agencies in expanding opportunities for competitive integrated employment, particularly for people who have the most significant support needs. And then, as you mentioned, I am a co-chair of CCD's Long-Term Services and Supports Task Force, and that's been a place where we have really been pushing on federal policy related to Medicaid and home and community-based services, both with Congress and with federal agencies. And I would say COVID-19 has just, really laid bare the risks that people with disabilities face in institutional settings and in congregate day settings. And so much of our advocacy has been, we need more funding, we need more supports for states' home and community-based service systems, because that's the way, not only does it advance people's civil rights and their inclusion, but that's the way we keep people safe through this pandemic. So coalition work is key, and it's key inside of Washington, D.C. And for folks listening who are at state and local levels, I think it's really important to find those coalitions. They exist at the state level, and we are stronger together when we kind of come in with a lot of different perspectives, but pushing in the same direction. It's really compelling to elected officials and to policymakers to hear, yes, we all are different and have different needs, but we have the same priorities.
Very good advice to the field. So you mentioned the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act. You mentioned the publication of the federal HCBS rule out of the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. Those both occurred in 2014. So we're about 6 or 7 years into implementation of both of those. And they, of course, require massive transformation at a state level of some of the key systems that you talked about: Medicaid, our workforce investment system, vocational rehabilitation, et cetera. How do you think we're doing on implementing what were the aims of both of those pretty landmark federal policies? And where do you think we've made some significant strides, and where do you think we're falling short of what the intent and vision and spirit were behind those seminal pieces of both legislation and regulation?
So I'm going to start being glass half full because you kind of have to be that way sometimes. And I do think the last 4 or 5 years have really led to significant changes in the way policy is viewed. I think that, when the Workforce Innovation and Opportunities Act came out, when the Advisory Committee report came out, there was certainly a core in the disability community who felt like we are way past time to end sub-minimum wages. We have got to be focused on competitive integrated employment. But I don't think it was like completely the mainstream. And I think that policy conversation has truly changed over time. I think if you look at the legislation that's been introduced, if you look at where even kind of policies of major disability provider groups are, I think the question is not if it's going to end, it's how do we do it? And that's a really big advancement. So I think that is really positive, and I think I feel really optimistic, whether it's this Congress or Congress 2 years from now, we are getting close. And the best evidence of that is the fact that when we issued the advisory committee report, there really weren't any states who had state laws that had prohibited sub-minimum wage. And now we're at 5 or 6.
I'm sorry, just to interrupt you for a second. The advisory committee you're mentioning is the advisory committee to increase competitive integrated employment for individuals with disabilities, which I mentioned you were a part of and had been selected to serve on in my introductory remarks. Can you tell us a little bit about the advisory committee and how it came about really quick?
Sure. So one important part of the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act was not only that it kind of set these new rules for vocational rehabilitation systems, but it set up a federal advisory committee. And the committee was in the statute really designated to bring together very diverse views. So everything from disability rights advocates to employers who use sub-minimum wage certificates to employers who only do competitive integrated employment. It brought together key federal partners that would have to make changes in policy to kind of advance competitive integrated employment. And the charge was to make recommendations to the Labor Secretary and to Congress, both on what steps would be necessary to increase opportunities for competitive integrated employment for people with significant disabilities. And I think it was really key that it was focused on people with significant disabilities, as well as to make recommendations on the use of these sub-minimum wage certificates that are currently legal under the Fair Labor Standards Act. So at the time we issued the report, and the report really, I think, is a blueprint for what Congress needs to do and what a number of federal agencies need to do to really line up policies so they support and incentivize competitive integrated employment instead of, as we talked about earlier, really disincentivizing employment and making that the hard thing to do versus the default.
And just real quick, that is the whole mantra, if you will, of employment first, right? Is making sure that publicly financed services and supports are really emphasizing competitive integrated employment as the preferred option or outcome of those services, as opposed to segregated day and employment services.
That's right. And, we have 32 states or maybe more at this point that have employment first. But when you actually look under the hood and you say well, what's your current capacity of segregated day services versus employment providers? It's in most states about 80% segregated day and 20% employment providers. When you look at, okay, financially, what are we incentivizing? What's kind of, if the power of the purse string, and how do we want to encourage providers in a certain direction? When you actually look at it, we still have so many states where to do supported employment, you actually end up losing money. And you do it because it's the right thing, but you don't do it because it's the thing that is incentivized in the system. So, that is, I think, a big problem of employment first. On the wage piece, at the time the committee report came out, there were no states that had passed laws that prohibit subminimum wage. So the way it works is federal law kind of sets the floor, but state laws can go higher. So even though federal laws could allow subminimum wages, you can have states that prohibit them. It's been pretty incredible over the last couple years, and I feel optimistic because we now have 5 or 6 major states, and they're not just the states you'd kind of think of, that we're already pretty far along in a pretty progressive developmental disability systems. I mean, I was pretty amazed to see that the state of Texas has now prohibited subminimum wage in their state use program. We have major cities like Chicago and Seattle that are passing this. And if we're kind of looking at what is on kind of being proposed in state legislatures, that goes up to almost 1/3 of states. So the more that we have states saying and showing, hey, we can pay people real wages and we can invest in employment supports and our system can do this, we have a lot more fodder and I think a lot more momentum to move bills like that in Congress. So I feel really optimistic about that. When we're talking about general inclusion and home and community-based services, the one silver lining of the incredibly hard fight to protect the Affordable Care Act and to protect Medicaid is we would go into Congress and people did not understand what Medicaid was. They did not understand what home and community-based services were. And when you explain it, they're like, wait, I support that. Wait, I want people to be able to live in the community. And Medicaid went from kind of being a really negative thing, I think, to a lot of people, to people really valuing and cherishing it. And I am optimistic that not only are we in this kind of protect what we have mode, but I think we have a lot of momentum, especially after COVID, to really think big about how we make sure people are getting the supports that they need to live and participate in the community, and really thinking of this and emphasizing this as a civil right. So those are all kind of the glass half full. But we're not there yet. We have a ton of work ahead. Many of us right now are looking ahead to a new Congress with an election coming, the potential of a different administration, and putting together our priorities. And we have so many things we need to keep doing. The home and community-based services settings rule that we talked about earlier is and should be truly transformational in every state. But it really depends on whether the agency overseeing it kind of makes it a check the box activity or really puts teeth in the rules requirements that people have to have a choice for competitive integrated employment. People have to have a choice, not just to be in disability programs, but to get supports in their own homes and in regular workplaces. So that's a place where I think we have a lot of work to do. At the state level, we have seen incredible progress in some places, and in other places, I think people have looked at the political climate and said, maybe these rules are going to go away. Maybe we don't really have to change. And going back to my personal story of kind of seeing the development of the disability system over 40 years, some of these services were developed 40 years ago when we had no clue of what people with disabilities were capable of. We came up with programs that were about supervising people and making sure people had a place to be versus making sure people really were able to reach their full potential and do the things that make them happy in life. And so this is the opportunity to modernize kind of outdated programs that are pretty segregated, that are pretty what I would call custodial, to more individualized and person-centered supports. But some states are kind of waiting to see if they really have to do it, because change is hard and change takes time. But there is the momentum and I think the desire from disability stakeholders, from self-advocates, from families, and even from providers to make these changes. So lots of work to do. I hope I'll have a chance to come back on this podcast and we can kind of in the future lay out, okay, what are our marching orders with a new Congress, with maybe some changed political climate dynamics. But I'm trying to feel optimistic that it's sometimes a slow march forward, but we are marching forward nonetheless.
Well, we'd love to have you on a future Employment First 2.0 conversation. Before I lose you, just real quick, for folks that are listening in that might be new to some of these issues or might have a loved one who is an individual with significant disabilities who wants, who is living in their community, or maybe even our self-advocates, or even folks who really haven't had a lot of exposure to these issues before, what would you say to someone that's an employer in a community, or a transition counselor in a school district, or just a young person who's wanting to get involved in their community and in some of these issues to support citizens with significant disabilities? How would you encourage them to plug into some of these issues at a community level?
So I have a couple of suggestions for different folks. So first, I can't be having this conversation in October before an election without letting people know how important it is for people to engage. Really become knowledgeable about issues that impact people with disabilities. We've talked about healthcare and Medicaid and home and community-based services and education and employment. And it is really important that people educate yourself about the positions of federal and local candidates and really think about that. Our voice matters, our voice and vote matter. And so I want to encourage everyone who's kind of in the disability community, it's important to engage and to think about these issues. This is an incredibly important way that we can change policy. So that's the first thing I have to say. And in an October,
get out and vote, people.
Get out to vote. For self-advocates and family members and allies, I want to assure you that you do not have to be a policy wonk to make a difference. You are the best advocate by being able to share your story. You know what is and isn't working in your systems. You know what's missing. And so get involved. There are so many ways to make a difference, whether it's joining, a self-advocacy group or a coalition around healthcare, or, joining the board at your church or your synagogue, or joining in the PTA at your school. There are so many opportunities to kind of lift up the important voice of people with disabilities, and ways to get involved in advocacy. So find your community and be active. And then the last thing that I would say, kind of on a personal level to all of us, whether you're someone who's, working in the community, or as you mentioned, someone who's just interested in these issues, we need to constantly be thinking about how we can make our community more inclusive and accessible to all people with disabilities. Every room that you're in, every table that you're at, I feel like we need to look around and say, who's not here that needs to be here, and why aren't they here? And, I think people often think about, I've done everything I can, we have a ramp on the front of our church, and so why is it that people aren't here? Well, we really need to take a step back and say, how do we really reach out and engage people? How do we really make sure people are welcomed in every aspect of our society. I think it's an important lesson, not just on disability, but kind of across the board as we're looking at diversity. But I think all of us really need to, with intentionality, think about how do we build true relationships with people with disabilities? How do we make sure people with disabilities have valued and visible roles in our community? And for people who maybe aren't sure that all means all, the last thing I'll end with is get to know someone with a significant disability. Go out and see it. I think the biggest impact, my brother Evan is an incredible advocate in his own right, but I think he has made such a huge difference with the thousands of people whose lives he has touched by looking at him and seeing, wow, this was someone who was told, you could never do anything on your own. And yet he is a living example of, with the right supports, people with significant disabilities can live on their own, can hold meaningful jobs, can be a board member of of their synagogue or church. They can be a member of the Georgia Council on Developmental Disabilities and lead kind of important policy discussions and have a girlfriend and have an active social life. And so get to know someone, see what it looks like, and I promise you, it will change your worldview.
Alison Barkoff, thank you so much for giving us your time, your expertise, your passion. It's been a great conversation, and I hope that that others have not only learned something, but are motivated to get out and really be a part of this transformation that's going on at every level of our communities, our governments, and our society. So thank you again for being here. It is great to see you, my friend, my colleague, my policy coach. So thank you again.
You've been listening to a joint episode of the podcasts TASH Amplified and Yes to Employment in recognition of National Disability Employment Awareness Month. For more about our podcasts, including show notes, links to articles discussed, a complete transcript, and a schedule of episodes, visit tash.org or yestoemployment.org. You can subscribe through iTunes or your favorite Android podcast app to have the series delivered automatically to your device so you never miss an episode. If you enjoyed today's episode, please share it with your friends and on your social networks. Today we talked with Alison Barkoff, the Director of Advocacy at the Center for Public Representation. For more about the Center for Public Representation, visit www.centerforpublicrep.org. For the Home and Community-Based Services Advocacy Coalition, visit hcbsadvocacy.org. The Youth Employment Solutions Center is the National Training and Technical Assistance Center for the Partnerships in Employment, or PIE, state projects. It is a collaboration of TASH and Transcend. You can learn more about the YES Center at yestoemployment.org, about TASH at tash.org, and about Transcend at transcend.org. That's TRANSCEN.org. The YES Center is funded by the Administration for Community Living's Administration on Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities, for the purpose of transforming state disability support systems to competitive integrated employment. AIDD is dedicated to ensuring that individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities and their families are able to fully participate in and contribute to all aspects of community life in the United States and its territories. Music for this podcast is an original composition and performance by Sunny Sefarati, the co-director and autistic self-advocacy mentor at The Musical Autist. You can learn more about The Musical Autist at www.themusicalautist.org. Keep following TASH and the YES Center, as well as the NDEAM and NDEAM 75 hashtags on social media. We'll hear from another outstanding employment advocate again next Wednesday.